Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are dialing in from. It's always good to see so many returning faces or returning names because I don't see faces. But speaking of returning faces, I do have at least one returning face that we can talk about in a second. Philip Broussard. Long story short, we'll get to that in a minute. I am your host, Matt Luckett. Today we're talking about the future of authorization. Authorization's been around forever, but it is an ever-evolving space that we're going to be talking about today. This is not the first webinar. This is, in fact, I think our 11th or 12th webinar in our series. We do these every month. If you are interested in any of our other content, please don't hesitate to check out the Axiomatics profile on LinkedIn. You can find all of our videos there. There's a great set of topics, everything from learning about the basics to the future, as we're talking about today. Joining me today is not Philip Broussard, it is David Broussard. David and I, we were having some fun before this call, and I thought we could extend the fun, which explains our Santa hats. But we are not alone today. We've got Gerry Gebel, and Gerry, you've got a long history with authorization and Axiomatics. Why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, that's right. So I worked with David for quite a while at Axiomatics. Had a blast doing that. Yeah, you're rid of me now, David. But not quite, because he and I, plus Omri Gazit, are co-chair of the AuthZEN Working Group over at OpenID Foundation. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And also recently retired from my full-time work and now just working on volunteer stuff. So I'm glad to be with you guys today.
Yeah, happy to have you. I'm actually really happy to be having this conversation. I'm not going to lie. I feel like every third or fourth call that I'm on at this point, AuthZEN comes up. So all of a sudden, you guys are going to give me a great resource that I can point people to come check out. So this should be a really fun conversation. But I don't really have a whole lot to add other than moderating. So with that in mind, David and Gerry, I'll hand it over to you guys.
All right. Thanks, Matt. So hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in on this beautiful, snowy Thursday afternoon here in Stockholm, at least. I know that snow is probably not something you get too much of, Gerry, down in Arizona.
Not too often, at least not at this elevation.
Yeah, exactly. So today we're gonna walk you through OpenID AuthZEN. We're gonna go back to the basics and introduce what it is. We'll talk about the latest draft. We're currently in draft 5, and that's the one we're working with to go to final specification, and we're targeting January for that to conclude. But in the meantime, though, we'll be at Gartner IEM in Texas, where there will be snow, fake snow, still snow, at the conference, where we'll be running an interop with other partners, vendors, open source implementations to show the value of OpenID AuthZEN. And then to wrap it all up, we'll talk about what's next for the working group. And Gerry, with that being said, what's OpenID AuthZEN?
Well, it is finally introducing some interoperability into the authorization space. We've had many different kinds of authorization implementations over the years, and it is that kind of thing. Well, how does this thing work with that thing? You know, do we have an adapter in the middle? And you know, it's something we got together as a group a few years ago now, and tried to look at the space and figure out, are there some relatively simple things where there's a lot of overlap that we can standardize? So that's what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, the work started in the summer of 2023 in Vegas, and it was really acknowledging the fact that different apps, different services, different SaaS, different COTS, different databases handle authorization differently. And of course, when that happens, Gerry, we end up with these silos of different ways to tackle access control. So people might have heard terms like AD groups, or role-based access control, or attribute-based access control, or maybe infrastructure policies inside of infrastructure, or even code, or some clouds like AWS and GCP provide something called Cloud IAM, which is a way to configure the identity and access management piece of those clouds. And then, of course, the older you go, the further away you go, the more likely you're going to find custom logic inside of applications that try to tackle authorization, right? So it is a very disconnected world. It is a very opaque world where each and every app, each and every service do authorization in whichever way they want or can. And therefore, if you want to answer the question, hey, I wonder what Alice can do in my system, you don't really know the answer, right?
Yeah, and I think especially for developers, this is really going to be a brand new world where all of that custom logic that you mentioned here, now they have a single set of APIs that they can utilize in their applications, and have the confidence that on the other side, a PDP that's implementing this same API specification will be able to interoperate with them. So hopefully it really simplifies the world for the application developers out there.
Yeah, and you mentioned the developers. It's interesting to see also the evolution of the space where, 15 years ago, the authorization startups of those days would focus very much on the IAM landscape and the security landscape. It was all about making sure you had the right policy in place to bolt things down. But then the newer startups or the newer initiatives like Topaz or Cerbos, they're very much about the developer experience. It's very much about saying, well, hang on a minute. You have a building block for databases. You have a building block for authentication. You have a building block for OAuth flows. You really need a building block for authorization, so you don't have to reinvent the authorization wheel every time.
Well, this
And
is
speaking,
this is an architecture graphic from a blast from the past, David.
yeah, we're not young anymore, right?
No, pretty not.
So this architecture diagram comes from a standard called Oasis XACML or XACML, or as you once called it, Gerry, Whack-A-Mole. But in fact, yeah, you remember that? In fact, that architecture wasn't really invented by XACML. If you go back to, I think, the 1970s, you'll find some network standards that also mention the whole concept of a PEP, a policy enforcement point, and a PDP, a policy decision point. And then more recently, NIST formalized it in the ABAC 800-162 architecture. They reformalized it in the zero trust. That's a typo there. It should say NIST zero trust, not NIST ABAC on the second point. 800-207 architecture. So it's a very common architecture that essentially decouples the app from the enforcement, from the decision making. And Gerry, I think you added an overlay here to identify the particular flow happening in step 2 and step 5. Why is that?
Well, that like I said before, when a bunch of people got together that were looking at places that could be standardized, this is what we focused on. That is the interaction between the enforcement point and the decision point. Because what was certainly discussed there is that the format of those messages is very similar across many different implementations. So that seemed like the very first logical place to start to standardize. Now, you've got some information later on where we'll talk about some of the future work that can be done. But this is where, when we look at version 1.0 of AuthZEN, this is what the focus area is.
Yeah, and it allows us to swap in, swap out policy decision points without impacting the enforcement point. So if we take, for instance, two of the major authorization implementations, Open Policy Agent on the one hand and XACML on the other, up until the days of AuthZEN, you couldn't easily swap them out because they had different interfaces, albeit 90% the same. Now we've actually achieved the 100%, so you can actually just plug in whatever PDP you want to use.
Of course, David, that assumes you have all the metadata and the policies are similar or the same in the PDPs, but otherwise the message exchange here will be identical.
Correct. Yeah. So it assumes that the scenarios in the backend are the same. Absolutely. Right. And so AuthZEN, when we started doing the work, so like I said, we started back in the summer of 2023, and little by little, we did a bit of prior art study. So we analyzed Open Policy Agent, XACML, Cedar, Cerbos, different ways of doing that PEP PDP interaction. And the first API we built was the binary authorization API. Can you perhaps tell us a little bit more about that, Gerry?
It is the most simple question or request that you can create. Can Alice view this particular record? A very simple, straightforward question where you're expecting a permit or a deny, a true or false response. And so that was the very simple initial API that was defined within AuthZEN.
And the payload in that API is simply JSON, really. It's a JSON request, an array of attributes, if you will, and attributes are just key value pairs. And then the response is a Boolean, very simply. It's a JSON object that contains a decision field, and the value of the decision field is either true or false. Yeah, we can also decorate it, right? If I remember correctly, we took a cue from the XACML obligations and advice mechanism to add an additional context object in AuthZEN that will let you express additional information like, reroute the user to a multi-factor authentication page, or send a notification to an alerting system, so on and so forth.
Right, and we have some JSON examples coming up here as well.
Yep. Oh, yes. We're going to get down to the nitty-gritty level. The second API, Gerry, is the batch binary API. So what's up with that?
Right. So you may have a number of questions that you want to ask about Alice. Can she both view and edit a particular record? Or you may have questions about a record, who can view this? Or, that's getting to the next one, sorry. But you have multiple questions that you want to ask in a single message to the PDP. So this would be similar to the XACML multiple decision profile. So it really just builds on top of the basic binary authorization API. So now you can ask multiple questions and you'll get multiple responses back to the policy enforcement point.
Yeah, and one thing that we did, that we try to do at least in the AuthZEN API, is to make it as easy as possible on the developer. So one thing, a pet peeve of mine in the XACML spec, was that the response was unordered. So if you asked, can Alice view, edit, delete record 123, the answer you'd get back one day could be permit, deny, deny, and the other day could be deny, permit, deny, right? The order was not guaranteed. So you had to do a work of correlation to understand which decision went with which question. In AuthZEN, we respect the order, so it makes the processing of the response easier. And that's something we really care about in AuthZEN, is making the developer experience as simple, as easy as possible. Because if it's easy, people will adopt the authorization APIs.
That's right, absolutely. Then I stepped on the search API here. So the search API was also incorporated into 1.0 for scenarios where you want to analyze a large, maybe potentially large amount of data and receive a certain list of items back from the API. So for example, with record number 123, you could send a search request that asks what users can edit record 123. And this API will send you back that list of the users by subject ID. So yeah, very powerful. And there's other places you might want to use this, right, David?
Absolutely. So the search API, it comes in three flavors, right? So the user search, tell me which users can blah, blah, blah. The resource search, tell me which resources a user can do a given action on. So tell me, which records Alice can delete. And then the action search, tell me what actions the user can do on this record. And that opens up, potential for data filtering. It opens up the potential for entitlement access review or entitlement provisioning, which is the scope of the interop we're doing in December. I'm getting ahead of the slides now. So it definitely enables a lot of new scenarios. That, by the way, Search API is something that was not planned for and not designed for in Oasis XACML. It was kind of an oversight in XACML back in the day. And same thing for Open Policy Agent. It was not planned for until they came up with partial evaluation, which is a way to tackle Search API.
Right, and then the last part of the final, the spec we're working on right now, 1.0, is a discovery API. So you can see we just talked about 3 different functions, and even within the search API, there's 3 sub-functions of that. So the discovery API endpoint can let a PEP know what functions a particular PDP supports. So this is similar to other products like in the OpenID, what is it, OpenID Connect world, David, that also
Oh,
have
yep.
a discovery endpoint.
Yep, correct. We took inspiration from OIDC and OAuth and just built a discovery API to find the endpoints that a PDP or that a PDP is exposing. Right. This is extremely useful when, as an administrator, imagine you're the admin for Salesforce and you want to configure the external PDP. You point it to the discovery API of that PDP, and everything else is filled in for you, much like it would for OpenID Connect. So, like I mentioned earlier, we're in draft 5, and the 60-day review. So OpenID has a process to take a draft through a standardization effort. So it starts with 15 days within the working group. We all vote on that. That happened, Gerry, correct me if I'm wrong, it happened at the end of October. And then past those 2 weeks, we open it up for public review. And so we're in those 60 days. They wrap up early January or late December.
Late December.
Late Christmas gift.
Yeah, it's late December, and then 7 days before that, the end of that 60-day period, early voting will begin, and then voting will continue 7 days after the 60-day period. So we're coming up right toward the end of this calendar year for that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That would be a great way to kick off 2026. So if you're a member of OpenID, please go vote. It's important for everyone, right? Vote for, vote against, abstain, but please register a vote. And before voting, give us feedback, right? It's important. It could be typographical feedback, typos happen. It could be more fundamental feedback on how things work. And speaking of how things work, here's an example of a payload. Like we said, very simple JSON structure. We split it up into 4 categories or 4 buckets, if you will. The subject category, the action category, the resource category, and then the not represented on this slide category called context. It is very similar to the model that Cedar uses and the model that ZACML uses. So ZACML calls them categories. Cedar calls them the I forgot the name now, Gerry.
Entities, I think.
Yes.
Is it?
It's not entities. Is not the word. I'm trying to remember the acronym they have for this. If Jeff was on the call, he could tell us. Hi, Jeff, by the way. But the point is, it's very simple to build. Type an ID for the subject and type an ID for the resource are mandatory attributes. A name is mandatory for the action, and then the properties object that you can see in the resource object is optional, and it exists both for subject, action, resource, and context. And in there, you can add additional metadata if you wanted to pass information like the owner of the record. This is where, earlier, Gerry, you said that in the PEP PDP architecture, you can swap out PDPs, but we have to make sure that the underlying policies are consistent with, within different implementations, and that the expected attribute retrieval is also consistent. So in a traditional ZACML model, we tend to rely on PIPs, attribute connectors, to go fetch missing metadata. A traditional open policy agent model expects that the information is passed up front, and that would be passed in the properties object. So these are things that you have to be aware of when implementing AuthZEN. The bottom line is it's very easy to write, and it's extremely flexible. It's also very easy to understand. Think that this request will eventually end up in an audit log of all the authorization requests that were sent to a PDP and all the decisions that were produced. And so you can use that for accountability and for auditing to know exactly who attempted to do what particular action. That creates what I like to call transactional authorization, meaning we're controlling access to a specific item. Can Alice view this specific item, as opposed to the search API that does more data-centric access control. And here, Gerry, we have a response as well. Like I said, it's just a simple Boolean, true, false, but it could also be enriched with contextual data. And if we want to see this live, let me switch to a different tab. I'm going to go to my Postman collection. Gerry, can you see that tab?
Yes, sure can.
Awesome. So this is a publicly available repo. You could just go to postman.com/axiomatics and you'll see the AuthZEN sample requests. And in there, you can go ahead and create your own request, and you can decide to insert different fields. You can see this is actually an older request because this uses the old attributes. So Here, I would need to update it and write type is going to be user, ID is going to be this value, action name is going to be read user, and then type and ID. Okay, and if I send that off, I'm going to get a response back. Now, depending on whether my PDP is up and running, it's going to get a response. I love it how Postman says I'm offline and yet I'm doing a live webinar. Please tell me you can hear me, Gerry.
Yes, you're here.
Awesome, thanks. And we get a decision back. Decision true. Great. So I hit my PDP. That PDP was defined in this URL. I'm using I think Axiomatics is PDP in this particular demo. But this is not the focus of this webinar. So here's another example, Gerry. This is the batch API. What's interesting here is that we have a common part. So Alice and record 123, that's the common part that will be reused across all of the other requests. So we're doing a question for read and a question for edit. So the question here is, can Alice read item 123? Can Alice edit item 123? And the answer is very simple. It's an array of decisions. Great. Awesome for functional access control, UI access controls, small to medium sized data sets, things that you know has a finite size. What about search, Gerry?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about search here. I think we covered some of these examples before. You know, we can search on subject, you know, who can view a particular record. We can search on the resource, which records can Alice view, and then the action. What actions can she do on that record? You know, there could be 2 actions possible. It could be 50, but we need, you know, so these are unknown numbers of responses, and it's just a simpler way to get that list of results rather than iterating down each one of them, because as I said, you potentially do not know how much data. So very useful for that sort of dynamic data filtering model. You also mentioned earlier about access to reviews and compliance or certification testing.
Yep.
Can be used in provisioning areas, right? You know, what roles should Alice be provisioned for a particular application, and things like this. So there's a number of things that can be done either in you know, real-time scenarios or in these sort of offline reporting or analytics type scenarios.
Search is definitely my favorite API of the 3 because it opens up so many new possibilities. So here's an example of the search request. I forgot we could have actually demoed at the previous interop we did in June in Vegas at Identiverse. We demoed the search API, and I should have remembered to open up the tab for that. If we have time, I might do that. So here, essentially, we're saying that we have user view record 101. And remember, Gerry, I said that ID was mandatory typically for the subject and the resource. But in the case of the search API, you need to skip ID for one of the categories, and then it becomes a subject search or resource search depending, right? So here, who can view record 101? And the answer is an array of users. So in this case, Bob and Carol can view record 101. So really happy to say that, you know, from the very early day, we had broad adoption amongst the PDPs. I think we started with 8 or 9 policy decision points, and we've broadened that to include, I can't do the math this quickly, but I think it's 15 or 18 policy decision points here. Most of them are policy-based, meaning that their configuration is through policy. So it's the case of Cedar, Cerbos, Open Policy Agent, Axiomatics, Ping, Talus. But then you also have non-policy-based products that use graphs or use ACL. So Endikite, 3 Edges formerly, is one of them. But also Topaz mixes both models. Okta and OpenFGA behind the scenes also use a graph approach. So it's interesting to see that different models, different approaches can all be fronted with the same APIs.
Right, and the other aspect here, David, is that you have both commercial products as well as open source.
Yes, yeah, interestingly. And then we have the API gateways, which is also quite cool. You know, back in the day, you'd have to go, you know, you as a vendor, say Axiomatics, you go to Broadcom Layer 7 and you say, hey, do you want to play with me? Do you want to plug in? And they would write the integration to go to Axiomatics. And then each vendor would have to do that. With AuthZEN, you can go as AuthZEN and say, hey, Broadcom or Kong, do you want to speak to 15 or 18 different PDPs in one go, do OpenID AuthZEN. So it was quite cool to see back in London those API gateways integrating so quickly and easily with AuthZEN policy decision points. So that brings us to the latest in draft 5. I think it was mainly a cleanup exercise to get to standardization, Gerry. One part of the work was the discovery endpoint that we built.
That's right. There were some typos. There was some cleanup of terminology. There was maybe some simplifications of certain things, and we enhanced some of the security considerations. So nothing that materially changed the functionality of the APIs or the sub APIs that we've talked about so far.
And by the way, here's an example of what the discovery endpoint looks like. If you go to, let me go to my endpoint. If you go to the pdp.alpha.guide as an example, /.wellknown/AuthZEN configuration, you'll get the AuthZEN endpoints for the and capabilities that that particular PDP exposes. Quite simple. Okay. All right, so upcoming interop. If you like snow, go to Texas because there will be snow at the Marriott Gaylord, where Gartner IAM is going to essentially take over the hotel and have different parties, vendors, architects, CIOs come and look at the latest in identity and access management, everything from authentication to authorization, governance, and more. We will be in booth 209. I promised my marketing manager that I would mention that we are in booth 209. Did I mention the booth number, Gerry? I can't remember.
I believe it's 209.
Oh, thank you.
David, we actually just got a question from the audience. What booth number?
209.
209. Thank you. Thank you. Perfect.
Thanks. I'm glad it's not 404. Before we talk about the interop that's happening in December, Gerry, can you walk us through the history of the ones we've done in the past?
Yeah, we've had, I don't know, 6 or 7 now so far, primarily at Gartner or Identiverse events. We really appreciate the support that both of those venues have provided to the AuthZEN Working Group. So we had our first interop back in June 2024. That was just the basic API, right? The binary API. And that was less than a year after the working group was formally founded. So that was really fast to get that first interop event together. And then you mentioned another one that we did this past March at the Gartner show in London. And that's where we focused on API gateways. So they were the policy enforcement point in the typical architecture. And it showed how you could, as an API gateway vendor, you can have one integration and it would be able to connect with any PDP that supported that basic API from AuthZEN. Excuse me. And then coming up, David, what are we doing next month? It's still next month, right? Yes.
Yes. Well, I've been promised a bit of barbecue, so I'm looking forward to that. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you mean the work?
Well, the IDP-centric interop, yes. We're focused on that today.
I thought you meant the fun of going to Gartner in Texas.
Yeah, it must be almost dinner time for you.
It is almost dinner. Well, come on, it's only 4:30. So yes, we will be essentially showing how you can use OpenID AuthZEN to extend OAuth and OpenID Connect flows. One of the things that we like to do within AuthZEN is actually look at other working groups and see whether we can collaborate together. So we're also trying to work with shared signals. It helps because one of the members of shared signals and share of shared signals is also a member of AuthZEN, so a tool. But here in particular, what we're acknowledging is that the traditional, I'm going to call it the traditional PEP PDP pattern, does not always work. Not all applications are capable of or able to be fronted by a proxy or a PEP. So in that case, what if those apps know how to receive and consume and introspect an access token? What if we could enrich that access token with metadata or information that did come from a PDP? And that's exactly what we're trying to do in this integration, right? We're going to get an OAuth authorization server. And I say authorization server, and really I want to stress this. I'm talking from an OAuth OpenID Connect meaning. So this is the place where you go authenticate a user and get a token back. And we're going to have that auth server reach out to a policy decision point. And there's two questions really the IDP can ask, right? The first one is, should I issue the token at all? That's not the most interesting one, by the way. It's a question that you can ask. But the more interesting question is, assuming I can issue the token, which claims should I inject into the token? So instead of relying on static configuration inside of the IDP that says, given the username, here's the claims and scopes that are going to be in the token, or given the request scopes. But now it's actually given the policy that is maintained by a policy decision point. Tell me which claim I can inject into the token. And this is what David, the architecture. Yep.
Right.
Go ahead, Gerry.
Sorry, David. And to be clear, the demonstration that's happening next month at Gartner is on that second question. What claims or scopes should be included in the token?
Yeah, exactly. We're only focusing on that one. And what's really cool is that most IDPs that we've reached out to and that are taking part, they all have extensibility capabilities, extension points, if you will, in their flows. I think in Okta land, they call it auth token flow. So in the auth token flow, you can call out to third-party service and do different things, including getting claims. And that's how we actually do that AuthZEN call, that little orange rectangle in the middle. It's thanks to the IDP's abilities to extend their core functionality. So the flow here is you have a user, Alice, on the left. She's authenticating in the app, redirected to the auth server, Okta or AuthZero, whatever it may be. And then as part of authenticating the user, the auth server is going to reach out to the PDP using the AuthZEN resource search request. Is going to literally, or actually action search. That's a mistake here. And in this particular demo, we're asking, tell me.
No.
Oh, it is resource search. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yep. Wow, I'm forgetful. It's age. So we're going to ask, tell me which records Alice can delete. So we hard-coded the delete in the AuthZEN call for this particular demo, but you could actually think of doing multiple calls. So you could say, there's view, edit, delete. So then the IDP could call the AuthZEN PDP 3 times if it wanted to. And so the use case we have, Gerry, is a use case that we built for the search interop we did back in June, where we were dealing with records. And we use records because the attendee can stretch their imagination and think medical record, banking record, transaction, whatever fits their vertical. And the policies for the search interop back in June was about viewing records, editing records, deleting records. And now for this particular IDP integration, we're focusing on the very last policy. A user can delete any record they own. And so the request we're going to be sending is, which records can Alice delete? And the answer we'll be getting back is that array of records that the user can actually delete. Make sense?
It does. And in these interoperability demonstrations, sometimes we constrain the use case, as you just described, David, just to simplify things and not make it too complicated, but also still to be representative of what can be accomplished.
Yep. So with that being said, how about we jump into the demo app?
Don't give away too much now. We still want them to come to Gartner and see the real thing.
Yes, I'll only show Academics. And I want to say big thanks to Alex Olivier from Cerbos, who actually implemented the demo app. And so this is what it looks like. Very simple. You can choose the PDP that you want to work with. So far, we have 5 compliant implementations. So Axiomatics, Cerbos, Signal, Topaz, WSO2. We've got a couple more that are going to be available shortly. And then on the IDP side, we have 4 IDPs so far: AuthZero, Curity, Glue, Duende. If you are an IDP, if you want to be in the limelight and support standards, call us, reach out to us on the mailing list. We'll add you to this list once you've done the implementation. And so here, what I can do is say log in with AuthZero. If I knew how to click. So I'm using Axiomatics and AuthZero. And we say Alice. And what's really cool is that in this demo, Auth0 does not know it's talking to axiomatics. It's abstracted away, right? And because it's standardized, it doesn't matter anymore. And so here now, what you can see is the request, the AuthZEN resource search request we're sending. Okay, tell me which record Alice can delete. And then the response that comes back is the list of identifiers. So record 1, 7, 13, and 19. And then what we do is inject it as a claim in the ID token below, right here. And we have, the usual claims that might come back in ID token. And then here we have the custom claim record. All right. And this is the token for anyone who knows how to read base64. This is what it looks like. And there we go, a bit of magic, Gerry. 'Tis the season for magic.
Not bad.
When you decode base64, who knew Google Slides could decode base64 like this? You get the records back. So, what's next?
Yeah, there's always more to work on, right, David?
Yes.
One that's been on our list that has been started is this notion of partial evaluation. So instead of it's a companion to the search API. So instead of sending back the actual list of items, you'll get back the evaluation criteria, if you will, right?
The constraints. Yep.
The constraints, yes. And then we want to write up formal profiles for some of the recent API gateway interop demonstrations that we did back in this past March. So just to formalize all of that so that additional gateway vendors can have a nice clean profile to follow. And then we want to do the same for the IDP audience that we're going to be demonstrating for here next month. We want to have a profile for that scenario as well. And I think you've mentioned a couple times, we do want to explore how we can integrate with shared signals systems. There's a lot of important information that a PDP server creates that could result in signals that get sent to other participants in that kind of a scenario. So we want to explore what that looks like. But I think for 2026, the two big items will be to finish the partial evaluation. Maybe that's part of 1.1 spec, for example, and then to see what interoperability with shared signals looks like.
Yeah, and I can think of two integrations with shared signals. The first one is when a PDP produces a decision, then fire off a signal saying, hey, this user has gotten access granted or access denied, right? That could be interesting to consume for other apps. And it kind of opens up as well a different pattern, right? Because so far, runtime authorization has been a synchronous process. The PEP sends a request and gets a response back in the same flow. But with shared signals, you can actually have async authorization, which is quite cool. And then the other aspect is assuming PDPs have data inside of them, or maybe data caches inside of them, depending on their implementations. What if you could refresh that data on demand through a signal? So essentially, a shared signals compliant producer would send an event to a PDP being a consumer or a listener and say, hey, the risk score for the user has changed. You got to update that value. So that's an interesting integration to lead to fresher authorization decisions. And with that being said, and with plenty of time left for a couple of Matt Luckett jokes to wrap the webinar, really I want to say standards matter. They matter big time. So we want your participation from everyone here. We're looking at building we're looking at customers to build a control plane within their enterprise, much like you have a control plane for user management or for privileged access management. Think about building a control plane for fine-grained access control across the enterprise so that you can break down those authorization silos. And then promote the use of standards-based authorization. Tell your IDPs, tell your API gateways, tell your other products, you need to support AuthZEN so that you can actually enrich those flows with authorization decisions. And that goes to the last point, right? Prescribe the use of AuthZEN. When you issue an RFP to buy a CRM or a CMS or an ERP, so many acronyms, tell these products, you need to allow me to externalize authorization. I do not want a silo anymore. I want to have enterprise-wide, fine-grained authorization, standards-based, with a standard pattern, and that pattern is OpenID AuthZEN.
Right, and so if you are so motivated to join us and participate, here's a number of links for you about the working group itself. You can get onto the mailing list. All of the work on the spec and even the interops is in GitHub. You can find it all there. We've got a Slack channel as well on the OpenID Slack environment. And we keep track of notes, mostly you and I, David, or Omri, making notes, and there's other documents within a HackMD environment. You've got our emails there as well to reach out to us directly. And as Matt said earlier, you've got a bunch of resources as well on the Aximatics website.
Yep. And with that, Gerry, thanks for coming out of retirement to talk about OpenID AuthZEN.
Glad to be here, David. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah. And then just to reiterate what you were saying, this is the GitHub repository. There's a dedicated folder for the interop material. You can read up about the interop. For instance, here we have a README that explains how it works, what the policies are, the architecture that we're using. Similar information is included in the HackMD that Gerry mentioned. So really, we have a lot of information online for you to help spread the word.
Did I see there's 2 new pull requests out there?
2 new what? I'm sorry?
Pull requests?
Let me see.
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
Oh, a dependent bot and one for the interop demo. Okay, cool.
Yep. You got some homework, Gerry.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, as David said, Gerry, great to see you outside of conferences. This is really amazing. Glad you're able to come out. I always like to do a bit of a recap, a little bit of tie a bow on it. I'm going to be honest. For me in this scenario, when it comes to AuthZEN, you guys nailed it. The world in itself is moving towards more of a standardized approach to everything. Whether it's authentication or authorization or any other technology out there, standards are becoming more and more of the de facto standard. It makes working together easier. It makes interop easier. And I think authorization is just the next flavor of standardizing everything. And really what it means to me, I look at a lot of enterprises out there, and enterprises, they are not great at having chosen one de facto approach to authorization. These are enterprises that have been around for decades. They've adopted so many different technologies that in a lot of cases, the CISOs of the world, they don't even know what they have. They don't know who has access to what. They can't answer some of these really basic questions. And that's really troubling for a lot of the ones that I talk to, which is amazing for AuthZEN, because it means that all of a sudden, any of these technologies like Aximatics that will work with AuthZEN means that all of a sudden, rather than having to reinvent the wheel or start to look at information across the board separately, you're able to look at them together. So that is my big takeaway from today's presentation. Gerry, from your side, what's the big thing you want people to know?
Actually, Matt, I think there's 3 things.
Beautiful.
Yeah, 3 things. One you just mentioned, interoperability, right? When David put up the slide with all the different logos of the participants in the recent interoperability events, there's many different flavors, like as you said, of authorization systems out there, be they open source or commercial, be they graph-based or otherwise. So it shows that it is possible with these very disparate systems to be able to interoperate with each other. And that's just something we never had before. So I think that's huge. The second thing I did mention was really the impact on developers, because up until now, like those organizations you talked about that maybe chose 3 or 4 different authorization frameworks or systems, then the developers had to know all 4 of those, or however many you might find out there. with the AuthZEN specification, now there's a single API for those developers to work with. And I think that's also a huge development for the industry, and it really can simplify their world. And then when you tie all of this together, the third thing I think that's really important to call out is the ability now to certify or report on compliance. To your other point, Matt, I've got these different systems. How can I actually tell who has access to what? And not just by inference. You're in some group or some department. Okay, that should give you access to this system or those resources. But now with a policy-based system behind who has access, you can actually, by specific reference, now know who has access, because this is the PDP system that is actually granting or denying it. So I think those three things: interoperability, ease for developers, and the ability to report on who has access to what. Both of those, all three of those things, are huge advancements from where we were even a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So obviously, you and I touched on the first and third together, but you called out a great one, the second one, which is the developer aspect. And I absolutely love that one, because people don't join a company and then just stay in their role, right? They tend to move around quite a bit. One project team needs a little bit of help from another developer, and that tends to lead to a learning curve. And that learning curve is fairly steep. It's fairly, I should say, not steep. It's very slow, which means that having a developer come in, being able to be effective from day one, is far more beneficial to that application team in order to roll out updates or changes to the policies. So yeah, I love that call out. David, same thing. What's the one thing or three things you'd love to see as a takeaway?
I echo Gerry's points. I'll repeat one. I think the developer piece is fundamental. If you do not bring awareness to the developers, they will invent their own thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's not their fault. It's because we have not done the work to actually say, hey, there's a better way, right? Writing a NIST ABAC document is fundamental. It's great, but it's great for the CIOs, the CISOs, the security architects, not so much the developers, because the developers don't go there. So reaching out to the developer, showing them those new patterns, point number one. And point number two, it's a brain fart. It just eluded me.
It is such a good point. Point number one, though. Yeah.
I know. It's maybe it is time for dinner. I don't know. Maybe I'm low on sugar. Point number two, I'll go with the transparency and the visibility.
That's amazing. Yeah, there's no shortage of good reasons why organizations should be adopting this. I think the prescribed that you called out earlier as well.
Yep.
When we talk about the developer side, really we're looking at mainly the internal or the homegrown applications that get created. What I like about the prescribed approach is the fact that you've got all of these commercial off-the-shelf applications that they've all taken their own approach to authorization. Mm-hmm. And that's great, but again, how do you get that common compliance, that common visibility across the board, and having it prescribed, having organizations go back to these vendors to say, we need this. We need a common approach. That is the last point that I'm going to call out. If there's no other comments, guys, I really appreciate this chat. Like I said, AuthZEN is coming up on every other call at this point. Really appreciate you guys giving us the deep dive and talking about the benefits that it offers to the community at large. On that note,
awesome. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks again.
Thanks,
Have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Enjoy.